Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the second part of my 1995 video in the Animated 90s series. Apologies for the lack of alternating video this week, but I got swamped with first week of school stuff, so look forward to the second part of the Hanna-Barbera Studio retrospective next week. Also, the next Doctor's Deep Dive will be on Spiral Zone, so that should be here around Monday or so. Also, with 75 opinions about whether or not to do review and demo type videos, and 90% of those saying yes, I feel comfortable moving forward. These will be more fun, well, for me at least, off-the-cuff videos rather than intensely researched and information-packed, and they'll be done as I've got some extra time in my schedule. They won't interrupt any of my regular channel stuff or replace anything else I'm already doing. They'll also go in their own playlists, so if they're not your thing, then no worries. So I'll just throw out the normal like and subscribe if you love all things animated and animation adjacent, and we can get right into those last 14 series I wanted to talk about in 1995. Just one single show to cover in this category for the year, and that's Dr. Katzs, Professional Therapist, which ran on Comedy Central for 81 episodes across 6 seasons. Created by comedian Jonathan Katz, the show is about a psychotherapist and his sessions with patients, who are usually played by a wide assortment of guest stars, interspersed with scenes of his home life and interactions with his slacker son. Most notable about the show from my perspective as a fan of the hilarious spy spoof Archer is that the character of the son is voiced by H. John Benjamin in his first major ongoing role. Oh, and the entire show is done using a computer animation technique called squiggle vision that keeps all of the character outlines constantly moving against a static background, and I really kinda hate it, but that's just my personal opinion. We had a few shows premiere this year that don't really fit into any of my other categories, so they get their own one here. Fair warning, 2 of them are actually kind of new and different, but the third is just because I didn't know what else to do with it. I'll leave it to you to figure out which is which. I'll start here with a series called San Bagito that aired for 13 episodes on CBS. The show followed a community of anthropomorphic insects in a town on the Texas-Mexico border through a series of bug-themed slice-of-life stories, while sometimes incorporating teachable moments hosted by a praying mantis professor. It's not a show I'm familiar with, but it stars Cheech Marin as a flea and legendary actor George Kennedy as a ladybug, which is enough to at least get me to check the series out. Next up is one based on a toy line that I never realized had been going this long. It's a toy line my own kids loved quite a bit, which makes me feel pretty old, even though I was still in high school in 1995. But it forces me to realize that by the end of this particular series I'll be covering quite a few shows that they watched as little kiddos. Anyway, the show I'm talking about here is Littlest Pet Shop, based on the toy line of the same name from Kenner, though now it's produced by Hasbro. Not much to say about this one. It followed the adventures of 5 miniature animals that live in a treehouse inside a pet store on Littlest Lane. It ran for 40 episodes in syndication this year, over the course of which it had animation done by studios in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, which I found pretty interesting. And the last series in this category may be one of the most important of the year, as it was Cartoon Network's take on MTV's Liquid Television, serving as a test platform and launch point for several of what would become the channel's ongoing series. The What a Cartoon Show's initial run lasted for 16 episodes between February of 1995 and November of 1997, showing a total of 48 different segments over its run. It started out with a bang, too, as the first 2 episodes aired were Powerpuff Girls in Dexter's Laboratory, which we'll be talking about more later in the series. This was also the launch point for shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken in this year alone. I'll mention other series that got their start here in the applicable years when I cover them. Needless to say that the show is heavily responsible for making Cartoon Network what it was in the late 90s. There were a pair of series that came out this year that I wanted to make sure got some extra attention, as they were things I'd consider to be true action series, but focused at a girl audience. This may have been a first since She-Ra came out last decade. We'll start with a series called Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders, or Starla and the Jewel Riders for our non-American friends. The show was originally conceived as an adaptation of Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern novels, but instead got a more Arthurian coat of paint applied as it was easier than acquiring the rights to the books. Plus, producer Bobot had been pretty successful with King Arthur and the Knights of Justice a few years earlier, so it was a comfortable subject area. The Jewel Riders are a trio of warriors protecting the city of New Camelot under the guidance of Merlin. The show is pretty traditional action fare, but there were a couple of aspects that made it especially noteworthy. First, and this one really adds to its action cred, is that it was directed by the director of and shared many writers with The Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers. Among those writers was Christopher Rowley, author of Starhammer, which Bungie co-founder Jason Jones cites as an inspiration for the Halo series. The other interesting bit is that the Jewel Riders themselves were an early example of what would become known as magical girls, which we'll talk about more in a bit. The show ran for 26 episodes across 2 seasons in syndication as part of Bobot's Amazing Adventures block. The second series I have in this category is oddly also about gems. It's called Tenko and the Guardians of Magic, and follows a young magician awarded the title of Princess Tenko and tasked as the guardian of the Starfire gems. These gems get scattered around the world during a battle with one of her jealous classmates, and Tenko sets out to retrieve them, accompanied by a diverse team of other guardians with various magical powers. It was a pretty good series with a nice foundation in magic and martial arts mythology with some good environmental messages, but it only lasted for 13 episodes in syndication. Now, I'm sure this is one of the categories most of you have been waiting for, but you should know by now that I always save the best, and my personal favorite, categories for last. Also, a small spoiler before we get into this one, I don't actually have an action category this year, as everything pretty neatly fit into one of the others. Back on the subject at hand though, let's look at one of action's closest relatives, superheroes. Just like last year, there were a decent helping of them appearing this year as well, but none were from the big two. In fact, we'll start with one that didn't come from comics at all, and maybe the series in this category that makes an argument for not being superhero-based. It's Sky Surfer Strike Force, which was another part of Bobot's Amazing Adventure block that ran for 26 episodes over 2 seasons. The series follows a man named Jack as he searches for a criminal that stole his father's greatest invention before destroying his lab and murdering him. Jack does this by assuming the identity of Sky Surfer 1, and together with 4 friends become the Sky Surfer Strike Force, battling the evil Cybron and his forces using the power of their Digitrans and transforming skyboards. The series is super 90s, with its extreme sports theme, and the character names aren't the best, nor are some of their costumes, but it was actually quite a lot of fun. I only recently discovered and watched it, and found it to be pretty era standard, but fairly well written and animated. I had a pretty good time with it. Next is another superhero of a sort that didn't come from a comic, but rather from the creative minds behind Batman the Animated Series, Bruce Timm and Paul Dini. It's about a young guy named Dexter who gains the powers of a cartoon character, and it's full of slapstick comedy and fourth wall breaks. What? You say I already mentioned The Mask? True, but this one is called Freakazoid, and the main character gets his powers from a computer. Also, comparing it to The Mask was kind of a joke, but you have to admit that there are some similarities there. Coming from the same creative team behind Tiny Toons and the Animaniacs, the show has a similar feel and comedic sense to those, which definitely isn't a bad thing. The character really isn't as godlike as The Mask, which works to the show's benefit, and the sheer volume of pop culture references embedded in it do as well. I didn't see much of The Mask when it aired, but this one I caught plenty of during its 2-season, 24-episode run on Kids WB. And now that we've covered a pair that didn't come from comics, let's look at one from the year that did. First, we'll turn our attention to Image, which you may remember gave us Wildcats last year. Well, another one of their launch lineup got the animation treatment this year with an adaptation of Eric Larson's The Savage Dragon, which premiered as part of USA's Cartoon Express. The series followed the efforts of a police officer battling against a nearly unstoppable crime syndicate overrunning Chicago. Oh, and the police officer is a nearly indestructible amnesiac human-dragon hybrid with super strength. It was a pretty great series with some really awesome character designs. It also had some serious voice talent behind it, with not only Jim Cummings as the main character, but Jennifer Hale, the voice of female Commander Shepard in one of my favorite video game series of all time, as a major supporting character, She-Dragon. It only ran for 26 episodes over 2 seasons, but I'd say it's definitely worth a watch. The other Image comic adaptation of the year, and the best of the 3 so far in my opinion, was an animated version of Sam Keith's delusional, maybe delusional, homeless superhero, the Max. This one aired as part of MTV's Oddities programming block for 13 episodes, covering the first 11 issues of the comic series, plus the character's introduction in Darker Image number 1, and the number 1/2 issue that was released for it. Anyone remember those number 1/2 issues being a thing for a while? They were kind of weird. Anyway, it was a pretty great show, very well animated and true to the comic art in most instances, and completely impossible to follow with any measure of certainty. I highly recommend giving it a look if you haven't seen it. The last superhero show to come out this year was from a new entrant into the comic book arena called Malibu Comics. Okay, well, maybe it's not fair to call them new since Malibu had been around since 1986, but they'd historically published smaller distribution, creator-owned titles. At this point in the 90s, they'd managed to find their way to small-town newsstands like the one I got my comics from, though, probably piggybacking on Image's success, as in 1992 they'd been the publisher of record and distributor for those comics. They also, in 1992, launched their Ultraverse imprint, which eventually gave us the animated series Ultra Force. Ultra Force was a team made up of Malibu solo title characters, kind of like the Avengers, that were a strange mix like that universe's first superhero Hardcase, the corporate-sponsored Iron Man copy Prototype, and the 13-year-old kid that transforms into the giant Superman-esque Prime, amongst others. The series only lasted for 13 episodes on USA, which is pretty unsurprising based on the obscurity of the characters, the low quality of the animation from Deke, whose output at the time was less than impressive, and the general sense of low quality of the show. It's still an interesting watch, but doesn't come close to the better hero series of the time. It's sad for me personally, though, as I'd been collecting Prime and Prototype since their series had come out. Well, I'm pretty sure that those of you who weren't waiting for superheroes were waiting for this, so we finally come to one of the biggest and most significant events of the year, in my humble opinion. Sure, we got plenty of Japanese cartoons imported to our TVs in the 80s, and even before that all the way back to the 60s. This year, though, we didn't just get Japanese cartoons, we got anime. Sure, we can look back now and call all the 80s series anime, sort of, but this is where we started getting full Japanese series with minimal editing, sometimes at least, and straight dubs instead of English rewrites or Franken-series made from several different shows. And the first of these series to premiere did so on the USA Network this summer, and also in syndication in some markets, with the American version of Legendary Armor Samurai Warriors, better known to us as Ronin Warriors. The series followed a quintet of prophesized heroes who appear to fight the demons of the Netherworld as they return after 1,000 years in banishment. Each of the Ronin warriors wears a different color armor and carries a different weapon, all empowered by their particular element. Due to some of the similarities between this show and the Power Rangers, it was licensed in the US to capitalize on that show's success, and it was pretty cool, and not a bad icebreaker. But there were two more that came in the fall of 1995 that were somewhat better representatives of the genre, even though they didn't really do so well. Let's start with a show that premiered here in syndication on September 11th of that year, though it had already done so in Canada on YTV a couple of weeks earlier, with Sailor Moon. This one was about a group of teenagers who were secretly the Sailor Scouts and could magically transform into superheroes to battle the forces of the Dark Kingdom. The first version of the show for US audiences kind of flies in the face of my earlier statement about minimal cuts, and to be honest, almost every anime that aired on a network around this time actually did suffer quite a few of those. But as it was licensed and adapted by Deke, that's not much of a surprise. For most of these early North American anime releases, Canada was really way ahead of the US, as they aired the series in prime time, while here it got unceremoniously dumped in early morning time slots where it didn't really get any attention. That ended up meaning that even though it had pretty great ratings in Canada, it failed in the US and got flagged for cancellation. Fortunately for Canadians, they were able to save it up in the Great White North through a fan petition, but it disappeared from US TVs until sometime in mid-1997. Unfortunately, Deke made some massive changes in this first American version, including not just character names and some of the dialogue, not to mention some of the more risque scenes, but they also removed everything LGBTQ related or dealing with any kind of gender fluidity. So I guess I should clarify. When I mentioned the minimal editing earlier, what I meant was in the home video releases of these anime that found their ways to US stores around the same time as the series aired, and in most instances were uncut versions of the original material, usually not even containing the English dubs. That was the true way anime started this year, with the TV versions merely being a sample that made people seek out the good stuff in stores, and is probably why to this day hardcore anime fans still say subtitled is the only real way to watch a series, even though modern English dubs are of uncut material. Hate me if y'all want, but I'm a dub fan myself, as I almost always multitask while watching shows and can't do that if I have to read. Moving on though, I have one final series to talk about here that did even more poorly in the US than Sailor Moon on its inaugural airing. It's a little-known anime called Dragon Ball. Okay, to cover my bases here, I'll acknowledge that this wasn't the first time Dragon Ball came to the US, but rather it was the first time it came to the continental US, as a subtitled version of the series had been shown in early morning time slots in Hawaii way back in 1992. Okay, I lied a little about that too, as the first time in the continental US was even earlier than that in 1990, with a short Harmony Gold dub in which all of the characters were renamed, and which had a failed test airing in a few cities. Their dub consisted of 5 episodes and a Franken movie of footage from the first and third Dragon Ball movies cut together. This year, though, the mainland US got an English dub by the newly established company Funimation, making its first airing on September 9th up in my neck of the woods, Rochester, New York. Again, though, in early morning slots. It wasn't as heavily edited as Sailor Moon, but it was a sanitized version that had anything remotely sexually driven removed or digitally painted over, with many of those edits famously involving either the removal or addition of underwear depending on the context of the scene. It lasted for 13 episodes in first-run syndication before getting canceled for poor ratings. However, I don't think that these 3 series were truly responsible for igniting the anime boom in the US, so I'm going to diverge from what I normally cover in this series to briefly talk about a new venture by a cable network that hasn't really come up much yet.
Saturday mornings on the Sci-Fi Channel, it's Japanese animation in the raw, and this ain't no swim in the kiddie pool. Saturday anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
For the lucky ones among us who had the Sci-Fi Channel in 1995, the network created a new Saturday morning programming block for the budding otakus called Saturday Anime. Though admittedly I can't find any resource that lists the exact date the block premiered, all of the sources I did find agree that it definitely was this year. Sci-Fi used the block to show anime movies with science fiction themes on Saturdays from midnight until the very early morning hours, but eventually moved it to the 9 a.m. slot. And talk about an impressive lineup, not only did the block air classic animes like Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and Vampire Hunter D, but also series movie tie-ins like Urusei Yatsuro's movie Beautiful Dreamer, video game adaptations like various Street Fighters, comedies like Project A-ko, and dark anime thrillers like Demon City Shinjuku and Perfect Blue. For those who were able to catch it, I'd say this is the programming that was truly responsible for introducing Americans to what anime was really all about. And don't worry, I do plan on doing a retrospective on this block at some point in the future. Well, that's it for the premieres in 1995, so like I normally do, I'll try to tell you all where these series can be watched as of September 2023. Although there are a handful of series from the year that have either never gotten a home release or are out of print, it's not that bad a list. These include Darkstalkers, which has some out-of-print DVDs, Littlest Pet Shop, San Bagito, which also has some out-of-print DVDs, The Schnookums and Meat Funny Cartoon Show, Space Strikers, The Adventures of Hyperman, Clutter, Tenko and the Guardians of Magic, which is yet another OOP series, G.I. Joe Extreme, What a Cartoon, though most of the shorts from it that became series are included as bonus features with the actual series release, Ace Ventura Pet Detective, Dr. Katzs Professional Therapist, again OOP, and Masked Rider, though you can get the original Kamen Rider Black series on DVD. Quite a few of the year's shows can be streamed easily enough, with Aeon Flux available on MTV Online, Savage Dragon and Street Fighter on the Roku channel, Happily Ever After Fairy Tales for Every Child on Hulu, and Timon and Pumbaa on Disney+. Ultra Force, Earthworm Jim, and Ronin Warriors can be seen on Tubi, and the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat, Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders, and Sky Surfer Strike Force are available on Pluto TV, with Princess Guinevere also on Peacock and Sky Surfers on Prime Video. You can also find Rupert on Prime Video while you're there, and Little Bear has an official YouTube channel if you're interested in that. In addition to those, several series like The Max, Action Man, Dumb and Dumber, Freakazoid, The Mask the Animated Series, Gadget Boy and Heather, Pinky and the Brain, The Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, Dragon Ball, and Sailor Moon can all be picked up on various paid services. Finally, a good number of this year's releases are available on DVD, including Once Upon a Time, The Americas, Aeon Flux, The Max, Action Man, Dumb and Dumber, Earthworm Jim, Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders, The Mask the Animated Series, Street Fighter, Pinky and the Brain, The Little Lulu Show, The Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and Ronin Warriors. Links are below as usual. And that's it. Everything that premiered in the US in 1995. What a generally awesome year, with quite a selection of really decent shows and some milestone events. What did all of you think, though? As always, feel free to share any thoughts at all down in the comments, especially if I missed anything, as with the counts getting higher and more networks showing series from more sources, it keeps getting harder to pin them all down. Lucky for me, you're all fantastic about picking up my slack, so I truly appreciate it. Anyway, look for a Spiral Zone deep dive on Monday and part 2 of Hanna-Barbera sometime midweek, as well as potentially a look at a game or something, as I'm really itching to talk about some of those. Also, drop me a line on your 2000 sub ideas, as I may hit that pretty soon. Maybe even on my birthday next week, which would be extra cool. I'm actually thinking about a collection video and office tour at 2000, if that interests anyone. Let me know. Either way, share your thoughts and I'll see you in the comments. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.